It is the 10th of October, 1941, somewhere over the Pacific. An American fighter pilot breaks through the clouds and spots one of Japan's newest bombers on the horizon, a sleek, twin-engine aircraft with an elegant fuselage, flying at speed that most Allied pilots had never seen before. He closes in. One burst from his .50 caliber machine guns tears into the wing. That is all it takes. The entire aircraft becomes a sheet of flame in seconds. The pilot watches it fall burning out of the sky, and he makes a mental note. The Japanese bomber that burns so easily, they will call it a lighter. This is the story of the Mitsubishi G4M, known to the Allies as the Betty, an aircraft that became a legend not for what it could do, but for how easily it died. Japan needed a long-range bomber. In the 1930s and early 1940s, the Imperial Japanese Navy was building an empire across the Pacific that stretched thousands of miles. The aircraft they had, the G3M, could fly over 2,000 miles with a bomb load, but it was getting old. Speed was dropping. Range was not quite enough. Tokyo wanted a new machine that could strike targets deeper into enemy territory, without support, carry a heavy payload, and still come back home. The requirements were ambitious, almost impossible. It was 1939 when a design team, led by Kiro Honjo at Mitsubishi Gato, work. What he and his engineers created would be, on paper, a triumph. The G4M was streamlined and quick. It could cruise at speeds around 230 knots, and its range over 2,200 miles was extraordinary for its time. It could carry an 800-kilogram torpedo or 1,000 kilograms of bombs in an Onin internal bay. It had 7 to 9 crew members. It was, in every measurable way, the long-range bomber Japan had asked for. The Navy accepted it immediately. But there was a cost. To achieve that range and speed, Honjo made one critical choice. He removed every protective feature that might slow the aircraft down or add weight. There was no armor plating around the crew or engines. There were no self-sealing fuel tanks. The heavy, complex tanks that expanded automatically when punctured by gunfire to stop fuel leaks. Instead, Honjo put all the fuel in unprotected integral wing tanks. They were lighter, much lighter, and they would work fine as long as the aircraft was never hit. The problem was that this was a war. The first real test came on the 10th of December, 1941, 2 days after Pearl Harbor. A flight of 6 G4M Bettys took off from airfields in Malaya. Their target was a Royal Navy task force patrolling off the coast. What happened that day changed everything. The Bettys found the British battleship Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser Repulse in open water. In the first large-scale naval battle, decided entirely by air power, the Bettys dropped their torpedoes. Both British capital ships went down. The Betty had proven itself. Tokyo was vindicated. Honjo's design was a success. For about a year, it was. The G4M became the workhorse of Japanese naval aviation. It fought across the Pacific. It sank ships. It hit distant targets. Pilots respected its speed and endurance. But something was changing in the way the war was being fought. By 1942, American fighters were getting faster and more heavily armed. They were also getting smarter about how to attack bombers. The P-40 and the later F-4F Wildcat pilots began to notice something about the Betty. When you hit it, it did not limp home. It did not catch fire slowly. One good burst, one spread of machine gun fire into the wing, and the entire fuel tank went up. It was 1942 when Allied pilots began calling it by a new name, the Flying Lighter, the one-shot lighter. Some called it the Flying Zippo. The names spread. By early 1943, it was understood among American pilots, if you got a bead on a Betty and your aim was good, that aircraft was finished, not crippled, not damaged, dead. The Japanese were aware of the problem, but they had few options. Armoring the fuselage would slow the aircraft down and reduce range, the very qualities that made it valuable. Adding self-sealing tanks would have meant installing heavy equipment that cut fuel capacity by a third. The Navy's demands for range were not negotiable. There was no way to have both the extraordinary distance and the protection that might keep crews alive. So Honjo and his team tried to solve it. They designed the G4M2, a supposedly complete redesign. It had a single spar wing instead of a more complex structure. It had a smaller bomb bay, but supposedly stronger protection. It still was not enough. The TICBIS 1 tick vulnerability remained. They tried again with later models, installing partial self-sealing tanks that cut capacity even further. Still, when an American fighter got close and fired, the Betty burned. By the middle of 1943, the losses were becoming catastrophic. Young Japanese pilots, many with less than 50 hours of training, were being sent out in Bettys that had a reputation for catching fire. They knew it. Sometimes crews would write final letters before missions, knowing that a single hit meant they would not be coming back. American pilots, by contrast, were flying in B-17 Fortresses with full armor, protection, and self-sealing tanks. The contrast was stark and brutal. One documented case from the summer of 1943 involved a formation of 6 Bettys escorting a high-value cargo. American fighters intercepted them. In the prot engagement that followed, 4 of the 6 Bettys were hit and burned. 2 crew members survived. 2 crews of between 7 and 9 men each died in flames that fell from the sky. This was becoming the pattern. The turning point came not in a single battle, but in the accumulation of data. By late 1943, every American pilot in the Pacific knew the Betty's secret. It was fast. It was elegant. It could reach anywhere, but it could not survive contact with an American fighter. The design that had been so clever, the choice to save weight and fuel, tanks for range, had become a death sentence. The engineers had built an aircraft that excelled at everything except survival. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor and one of Japan's greatest naval strategists, died on the 18th of April, 1943, flying in a Betty. His bomber and an escort were intercepted by American fighters. Both Bettys went down, burning. Yamamoto was gone. The loss reverberated through the Japanese Navy. By 1944, the Betty was no longer a frontline weapon. It had been pushed into less demanding roles: transport, reconnaissance, the occasional night raid. But damage was done. The aircraft that had sunk capital ships and dominated the early Pacific War had become a symbol of obsolescence. Every new pilot who climbed into a Betty cockpit knew what the Allies had learned. One burst, and you are a fireball. The truth was that Kiro Honjo and his team had been right about one thing: you cannot have everything. You cannot have extraordinary range, high speed, significant bomb load, and full protection all in one aircraft. Something has to give. The Allies understood this. The American B-17 took on armor and self-sealing tanks because the Americans believed survival was more important than reaching slightly farther. The British did the same with their bombers. They sacrificed some range for crew protection. Japan made the opposite choice. The Navy wanted range above all else. Range meant the ability to strike without warning, to hit targets nobody else could reach, to project power across an ocean. So the engineers removed the weight. They bet that the Betty would be so fast and so agile that it would not need protection. They bet that it would not get hit. But every aircraft gets hit eventually. And when the Betty did, everyone watching knew what was going to happen next. The war ground on. The Betty continued flying until the very end. In the final months, kamikaze Bettys loaded with explosives instead of standard bombs were sometimes sent on suicidal missions. In a way, it was fitting. The aircraft that had always burned easily was now being sent deliberately into flame. Some Bettys made conventional bombing runs right up to August 1945. They were shot down. They burned. That was what happened to Bettys. When historians count the aircraft of World War II, the Betty is remembered as a remarkable design. The range was unprecedented. The speed was impressive. The bomb bay was well conceived. But every pilot who flew it, every engineer who built it, and every Allied fighter pilot who chased it knew the same truth. The design that sacrificed survival. For Reach had created an aircraft that was brilliant and doomed. The Japanese called Ite Riko, a technical designation. They called Ite Hamaki de cigar because of its shape. But the names that stuck, the names that mattered, were the ones the Allies gave it. The Flying Lighter, because that was what the Betty had become. An aircraft so fragile, so vulnerable to fire, so prone to burning that it might as well have been made of wood and oil and kindling. One match, that is all it took. By the end of the war, over 2,000 Bettys had been built. The majority of them were destroyed, some by enemy fire, some by accidents, some deliberately sent on missions, where the outcome was never in doubt. The Betty had proven that there is a price for every choice in engineering. The price for range was survival. The price for speed was armor. You cannot design an aircraft for everything. The G4M Betty is proof of that. What makes the Betty story matter today is not that it was a failure. It was not. On its own terms, it succeeded. It flew farther than its competitors. It was faster. It could deliver a BEM payload that mattered. The Betty worked exactly as Honjo designed Ito work right up, until an enemy fighter appeared. Then the design became a vulnerability. A brilliant compromise became a fatal one. This is the story of how engineering decisions made in peacetime choices about weight and fuel and protection determine who lives and who dies in war. The pilots who flew the Betty did not make those decisions. They paid the price for them. They were young men who had trained for a few weeks, climbed into an elegant aircraft, and learned too late that elegance and survival are not always the same thing. By watching this, you are keeping that truth alive. Do you think Japan should have sacrificed range for protection earlier, or was extending the range worth the cost and crew lives? Let me know in the comments. If you learned something new about WW2 aviation, hit like so YouTube shows this to more people. It helps the channel reach people who care about history. Next time, we are going to look at another aircraft that made a different choice, the Avro. Lancaster was built for one specific mission, the Dambusters raid, and the British engineers designed it around that single objective. Armor, range, everything came second. You will want to see what they accomplished. Subscribe so you do not miss it. Thanks for watching.